What's going on, folks? Ted from Immersion here, and I've actually recorded this video probably 6 or 7 times and haven't had a chance to actually put it out. So I'm going to do that now, and this is going to be talking about the WotC layoffs, or sorry, the Hasbro layoffs, which we now officially know is true that WotC people are involved. When this story broke on Monday by the folks at the Wall Street Journal, it was just known that around 20% or 1,100 employees were going to be laid off from Hasbro. At the time of that article being released and several other articles you may have read, it was unclear whether Wizards of the Coast was going to be impacted. I can tell you with 100% certainty that that is the case, and a list has been compiled and has been posted on Twitter, which we'll go through, of folks that were unfortunately let go. So I just wanted to go ahead and talk through it, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about some of the greater impacts this will have. So, again, like I said, the Wall Street Journal broke the news. This right here is a Forbes article that basically is just detailing a bunch of companies that have been releasing people as of late. It's not just Hasbro. But I think this AP News article here is a really good one that just talks on the high level just about Hasbro. And then there's a Dicebreaker article that delves into a little bit more here. But basically, what it states here is that earlier this year, I believe it was in January, Hasbro cut 800 jobs in an attempt to save up to $300 million annually by 2025. So right there, we know they're trying to save $300 million annually by 2025. Now, I don't know if that means $300,000 this year and next year and in 2025, or just working up to that. But either way, that's a large amount of money to save, and one would think that cutting 800 jobs and the salary of those 800 people might get you close, but apparently that's not the case. Again, toy sales are down as a general whole. This is basically an aftermath of the pandemic and COVID-19. It states it here, and it is true. We experienced it in my life. You may have experienced it in yours, that during the pandemic, which is also wild to think that it was 3 years ago when this all started, is people were home all the time. Basically, there was nothing, you couldn't even really go out that much. You were limited in where you could go and what places were open. So you were confined typically to your home. If you were working remote, you might be looking, and your children are out of school, you might be looking for things to keep them entertained while you're doing that, and that would be, again, something like toys, or, you might have been more involved or into video games or tabletop gaming or things like that because it was a means to connect or socialize with people, or just honestly something to do because you couldn't go out and do anything else. And I think what we're seeing kind of across the board, not just here, but in other industries as well, is that companies shifted their projections based on the money and the revenue they were getting during COVID times. And that number has obviously drastically gone back the other way as things have returned to normal. Kids are in school. People aren't looking to do things to entertain themselves as much as they were previously. And companies are unfortunately falling short of their projections by a pretty serious amount. And now we're starting to see the repercussions of that, which unfortunately, again, in this instance, looks to be like losing 1,100 folks at Hasbro. So we have a quote here from Chris Cox. It says, "The market headwinds we anticipated have proven to be stronger and more persistent than planned. While we have made some important progress across our organization, the headwinds we saw through the first 9 months of the year have continued into the holiday and are likely to persist into 2024. And goes on to say that they will focus on fewer, bigger brands, gaming, digital, and our rapidly growing direct-to-consumer and licensing businesses. Now, I'm not really sure what their direct-to-consumer options are. This might be things like your Hasbro Plus crowdfunding, but we are seeing that they say they're going to focus more on gaming and licensing. Gaming, I think, is basically, we're talking about Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons. Then there might be some board games and things in there, but I think those are our two big ones. And honestly, what we've seen consistently over the past few years is that Wizards of the Coast has kind of become the golden goose at Hasbro. The thing that's pulling in the most money for them is whatever they have invested in, the products coming from Wizards of the Coast. Now, Magic the Gathering has kind of always been something that prints money. That's just kind of how card games and things work. And in the past, Dungeons and Dragons was kind of like a small little aspect of the company, but as we've seen over time, has grown significantly to become one of the biggest breadwinners for Hasbro. And to see that they're laying off a variety of people from Wizards of the Coast just feels really wrong to me. Obviously, notwithstanding the fact that you're laying off all of these people 2 weeks before Christmas, which is obviously not a great way to go about it and a real bad look for a company that really needs to do the best they can to prove that they're not as horrible as we think they are and doing a pretty bad job of it. But you're also laying off people from the things that are basically helping to keep your company afloat. And I don't understand the business logic behind that, but either way, I'm not a corporation. So let's go ahead and read this Dicebreaker article, as this has a little more catered information towards the layoffs themselves. And Hasbro and WotC, right? So, again, we talked a lot about this. Let's see. They also mention here Baldur's Gate being one of the biggest licensed products that they've released. And obviously, we know Baldur's Gate is just, it's become like a cultural phenomenon, sweeping the Game Awards and all this kinds of stuff. But that's a licensed product, so we might see more stuff like that coming in the future. While we're confident in the future of Hasbro, the current environment, this is again a quote from Chris Cox, the current environment demands that we do more, even if these choices are some of the hardest we have to make. Cox said in an email to staff and published by the Wall Street Journal. I know this news is especially difficult during the holiday season, he continued. There's no sugarcoating how hard this is, particularly for the employees directly affected. Obviously, this is a press release statement, but it obviously comes off as very insincere. And it's even just skeevier when you have the rest of the memo characterize the mass layoffs as, quote, a last resort, and probably one of the sickest sentences I'm going to read here is, quote, a lever we must pull to keep Hasbro healthy. That just feels just so wrong, right? That just feels real like skeevy business language, and it's just, if you go on to read the next line that they have here, he stepped into the role of CEO in February of 2022 and now earns an annual salary of $1.5 million and received $9.4 million in total compensation last year. Obviously, there's some money that could be taken from executives in the C-suite that could be given to employees to help figure out a way to recover. It also goes on to state something that I think is pretty interesting here as well, is that it says that affected employees will be notified over the course of the next 6 months. I thought that meant that sometime in the next 6 months, people will be released. And this isn't an uncommon corporate practice where, like, hey, we might need to know we're gonna lay you off, but layoffs are coming, in May, let's say. That gives you 5 months or so to get your life in order, start looking for a new job, whatever the case may be. Well, that's obviously not the case, as a lot of folks were laid off on Tuesday from Wizards of the Coast, and we'll get to that list in just a bit. It also goes on to state that they're going to basically vacate their lease for their main Hasbro facility in Providence, Rhode Island. Again, it talks a lot about how people were basically, executives were forcing folks into the office because they're paying for that space. I mean, there's no way to know how much that lease is, but this is a monthly lease for not only just the space, but then also all of the utilities and things like that you're paying for to have that space. That's probably a pretty sizable savings. With that and the 800 jobs you cut earlier in the year, you still find the need to cut 1,100 jobs. I mean, again, I don't know the overall cost of all of this, but I have to imagine not having a physical location anymore like that's going to be pretty significant savings. Again, this article, when it was written, says it was unclear whether it would affect Wizards of the Coast. Excuse me, we obviously know that that's true. It says, Cox mentioned that the company broke the glass on decimating their workforce as a last resort, fails to account for any reduction in executive salary bonuses or additional compensation. The sale of the physical office is a drastic move for a company as old and traditional as Hasbro, but leaving 1,100 people without financial security days before Christmas doesn't exactly lend Cox and other C-suite members much of a charitable position from which to argue. And obviously, that's very much true, right? We've talked about how Hasbro and WotC were in a pretty bad spot given the whole OGL situation and how they've been trying to rebuild trust, at least specifically on the WotC side. Hasbro is Hasbro. But yeah, you're not gonna really garner any sympathy here when you go about and don't do anything for your own salaries and then end up cutting all of these jobs. I know there was a really good quote going around. Let me see if I can pull it up here, but basically from Nintendo, where Satoru Iwata a couple of years back, when Nintendo wasn't doing so well, took a massive hit to his own pay in order to make sure they didn't lay off anybody. Um, let's see if I can find it here. Yeah, here it is. James Hake posted it here on Twitter. It says, once upon a time in 2014, Nintendo took hard losses. Their president, Satoru Iwata, cut his own pay by 50%. Legendary game designer Shigeru Miyamoto willingly took a 30% cut. Other board members also cut their pay by 20%. They did this to avoid firing staff. And yeah, it says, again, Iwata cut his pay in half for 5 months to pay for it rather than blame others for laying off workers. And that, obviously, again, is a good example of leadership. This is a company, and the folks at Nintendo, obviously, pretty awesome stand-up people to say, hey, us and the high-level executives, we're going to cut our pay in half for whatever it is, or take pay cuts willingly to make sure we don't have to lay off people to recoup. Again, the Wii U, as we know, was kind of a weird thing, and it didn't do as well as, obviously, the Switch is, and the Wii was great, and the Switch has been great. The Wii U was kind of a weird in-between step. So the revenue didn't really hit where it was supposed to, but again, the executives took ownership of that and said, we'll take the hit so that our employees can stay in their job as we recoup and reinvent. And obviously, that's not what we're seeing. And anytime you log on to Twitter and see that WotC or Hasbro is trending, you know that it's usually not a good thing. Last thing I wanted to talk about here is, again, we have that confirmed list of folks that have been laid off from Wizards of the Coast. This is from Christian Hoffer over, comicbook.com over here on Twitter. Folks laid off as a Wizards of the Coast. This was at 9:45 a.m. on the 13th. Dan Dillon, who's an awesome person and a game designer. I hope somebody snatches him up really quick. Mike Merles, who I didn't even realize was still at Wizards of the Coast. Chris Lindsay, who helped architect the DMs Guild. Chris Lindsay also did a bunch of stuff for Adventures League. Liz Shue, head of licensing and publishing for D&D. Bree Heiss, art director for D&D. I believe they were the one who did all of the art direction for the Deck of Many Things, I believe. Natalie Egan, product manager. Amy Dallin, who's, of D&D Beyond, host, producer. Jesse Hill, community manager for Magic the Gathering. Larry I also apologize for mispronouncing anybody's name. Larry Fromm, senior communications manager. These are folks who have been publicly mentioned that they were laid off. And then we have Aiton Bernstein, senior development editor, who's also laid off. Desiree Dawn, program manager. Some more confirmed layoffs. Vanessa Kunan, associate systems administrator. Michael Rexford, senior data scientist. Ellie Lockhart, analytics engineer. Jana Hodkins, technical producer. Megan Galbraith Donahue, director of MTG Universe's Beyond Creative and Production. Another confirmed layoff, Mike Valancourt, art director of packaging and product for Magic the Gathering. David McDarby, game director for Magic the Gathering. I've been informed that at least one person on my list was a voluntary retirement. Okay. I'm double checking my list. A few names in the initial tweets came from N-World. But all folks since then have come forward publicly. Just want to keep the facts straight. Let's see, talent manager and producer for MTG, Paul Cheon. Robert Sather, art manager. So there we go. So that's a large list of folks that we see are obviously not just from the D&D side of the house, but also folks from the Magic the Gathering side of the house. I think a lot of these were also from pulled from LinkedIn as well, for people who are now looking for jobs and things. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me for, when your traditional toy sales are failing, but Wizards of the Coast is doing, well comparatively and being the one who pulls in a lot of your revenue, you're going to cut those folks. And then there's obviously a lot of tinfoil hat theories that I won't really go into because there's no way to really know, and they're conspiracy theories in that respect. But that a lot of this was just a means, obviously this is all a means to gain shareholder revenue, right? To get backing and investment, from their investors. And it also makes me wonder was how much of this was integrated, right? This is coming. We're looking to have a massive boon now in 2024 for, Wizards of the Coast revenue wise. They cut all of these jobs. They're relinquishing their physical location, and they're also planning to release things major in 2024 for the 50th anniversary, which on top of all of that sounds, again, when you're presenting this to investors as like a big, hey, like, let's, stir them up into a frenzy to come out and provide a whole bunch of funds to us. Again, it was the OGL orchestrated in part of this, some sort of grand scheme to sort of tank the company to then be able to build it back up with a ton of investor revenue, or investment. I don't know, but it's definitely going to put a lot of focus and criticism and, a watchful eye on everything that happens in 2024, which again, we know is going to be the 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons, which is going to have things like the 2024 updated core rulebooks, the, level 1 to 20 adventure, and all the other things that we heard about at PAX Unplugged that they're going to be releasing. There's going to be a lot more scrutiny on that, I have to imagine, than there would have been previously, because obviously from a shareholder and investor standpoint, this is going to be kind of one of your big things you're going to be touting from the Dungeons and Dragons side coming into 2024. So, that could be a good thing. It could be a bad thing. I don't know how much sway these investors and shareholders have in what happens at the company, but, that could impact, maybe that impacts when things release. Do they release before they're ready? I don't know. Ultimately, though, it's extremely disheartening and saddening. My heart goes out to all of the folks that were let go from not just Wizards of the Coast, but from Hasbro as well. For what it's worth, if any of you out there want to come and chat with somebody, I mean, I have my platform. If you'd like to chat about whatever you can chat about, feel free to reach out. You can hit me up here in the comments on any of my social media, and we can have a conversation. It's unfortunate, and again, it's just real shitty that the timing as well, which obviously you can't tell me this wasn't a means to, save a bunch of money for the end of the year so that your first quarter of 2024 looks really powerful in comparison, because they know they're going to have an investor call sometime in January, February, and they can talk about all the money they saved, which is just real shitty that this is at the cost of a bunch of people at your company. So it's unfortunate that this is the second time in 2 years that in this time frame in December, I had to come on and talk about some real shitty business practices from Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast. Last year, it was the impending changes that were coming with the OGL, and now it's unfortunately relinquishing a lot of really good, talented folks from the biggest brand, side of the house from Hasbro and the biggest moneymaker they have, and they're just cutting these people. I don't know. Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. I'll see you all next time.